The war was a brutal, all-consuming fire that raged across a continent, scorching the souls of millions. It promised glory and domination, but delivered only ash and despair. By 1945, the Third Reich, a dream built on hate and conquest, was crumbling. The once proud German military, now a shadow of its former self, was disintegrating. Amidst the chaos and desperation, a different kind of soldier found themselves caught in the relentless tide of history: the women. They were nurses, signalers, and civilians caught in the crossfire, and as the Allied forces closed in, they faced an uncertain future. For many, the victors were not just liberators, but avenging angels, and the stories they'd been told painted a horrifying picture of what awaited them. But for one group of German female prisoners, the reality was a shocking, bewildering contrast to the propaganda they'd been fed. A testament to the strange and complex nature of humanity in the face of unimaginable conflict. Their story is a quiet, powerful footnote in the history of the war, a tale of unexpected kindness amidst the ruin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, a heavy, earthy perfume that clung to the damp German soil. It was late March 1945, and the relentless advance of the American Third Army under General Patton had become a thunderous drumbeat on the Eastern Front. For Lieutenant Anna Schmidt, a Red Cross nurse who had been tending to the wounded in a makeshift field hospital near the Rhine, the sounds of war were no longer distant rumbles but the immediate, terrifying reality of her collapsing world. For months she had worked tirelessly, her hands stained with blood and dirt, her spirit wearied by the endless procession of mangled bodies and haunted eyes. The men she cared for, once proud soldiers of the Wehrmacht, were now boys, shattered and broken, their bravado replaced by a profound, hollow fear. The hospital, a repurposed schoolhouse, was a bastion of quiet suffering, but even that sanctuary was now compromised. The American artillery was getting closer, the concussions rattling the window panes and sending shivers through the worn floorboards. Anna was a striking figure, even in her weary state. Her blonde hair, once a vibrant shock of gold, was now dull and matted under her Red Cross cap. Her blue eyes, though sunken, still held a fierce intelligence and a deep well of empathy. She had enlisted out of a sense of duty, a belief in the cause she was told was just and necessary. But the grim realities of the front had long since eroded that youthful idealism. Now all that remained was a fierce determination to protect the lives under her care, no matter the uniform they wore. When the order came to evacuate, it was a chaotic scramble. The hospital had already been hit once, a stray shell tearing a hole in the roof and showering the patients with plaster dust. The wounded who could walk were sent on a perilous journey west, but the most critical cases had to be left behind, a decision that tore at Anna's heart. It was a mercy, she told herself, to leave them to the mercy of a more equipped enemy rather than let them die on the road. As the remaining medical staff and a handful of walking wounded retreated, the road was a river of desperation. Civilian refugees, their faces etched with hunger and fear, trudged alongside weary soldiers. The once clear lines of authority had blurred. The war was no longer about front lines and strategic maneuvers. It was about survival. A senior officer, a colonel with a missing arm and a wild look in his eyes, gave them their final orders. "Head to the American lines," he rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They will take you as prisoners. It is the only way you will survive. Tell them you are medical staff. Do not resist." His words were a bitter pill to swallow. The propaganda had been relentless. The Americans were savages, conquerors who would show no quarter. They were told of rampant violence and abuse. For Anna and the other nurses, the prospect of surrendering was not a relief, but a plunge into the abyss of the unknown. They walked for days, a small, weary band of women, their uniforms stained and their boots caked in mud. The biting cold of the early spring nights made sleep impossible, and the constant fear of being caught between warring factions kept them in a perpetual state of anxiety. The sound of distant gunfire was their constant companion, a reminder that the world they had known was gone forever. One evening, as a cold rain began to fall, they stumbled upon a hidden ravine. The path was slick with mud, and the descent was treacherous. At the bottom, a small stream gurgled, and on the other side, they saw it, a small encampment. A faint wisp of smoke curled into the twilight sky. It was too late to turn back, and the exhaustion was a crushing weight. They moved forward cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they drew closer, they saw the figures huddled around a small fire. They were soldiers, but not German. Their helmets were a different shape, and their faces were young, some barely more than boys. They spoke a language that was guttural and foreign, yet with a familiar cadence that sent a jolt of recognition through Anna. These were the Americans. The moment they stepped into the small clearing, the soldiers' heads snapped up, their hands instinctively moving toward their rifles. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Anna swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "We are nurses," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "We are surrendering. We have wounded with us." The young American soldier who was standing guard, a private named Miller, lowered his rifle slowly. He looked at the bedraggled group of women and saw not the enemy, but a mirror of his own weariness. His face, smeared with dirt, was tired, but his eyes were gentle. He said something in English that Anna didn't understand, and then gestured for them to approach the fire. One of the other soldiers threw a blanket over the shoulders of a shivering nurse. The smell of hot coffee wafted toward them, an aroma so potent and comforting it brought tears to Anna's eyes. They sat in silence, the tense anticipation of a violent confrontation slowly dissolving into a strange, cautious détente. Anna was still on guard, her mind racing with the horrific tales she had been told. This was a trick, a temporary politeness before the inevitable abuse began. But as she watched the young soldiers, their faces illuminated by the firelight, she saw only an exhausted humanity. They offered them food, a tin of something she had never seen before, and a canteen of water. The quiet acts of simple courtesy were so profoundly unexpected that they were almost disorienting. It was a surreal moment, sitting by a fire with the enemy, sharing a meal and the silent acknowledgement of a shared humanity in the middle of a war-torn forest. But this was only the beginning. The next morning, they would be taken to a formal processing camp, and that was where the real test would begin, where the fragile truce of the night would either be cemented or shatter completely. Anna's heart pounded with a mix of fear and a bewildering hope. The reality of their captivity was about to begin, but what she would discover there would challenge every notion she had ever held about the enemy. The journey to the main processing camp was an uncomfortable, jarring ride in the back of an American military truck. The women, all 23 of them, were crammed together, their bodies jostling with every rut and turn in the muddy road. The guards, 2 young privates with weary faces, sat silently on the benches opposite them, their rifles cradled in their laps. There was no conversation, only the monotonous drone of the engine and the rhythmic slap of the tires on the wet pavement. Anna sat beside a young nurse named Lena, a girl barely out of her teens who had been reduced to a trembling ball of nerves. Anna, ever the protector, placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. "It's all right, Lena," she whispered. "We'll be safe." But she didn't believe her own words. The camp, a series of drab tents surrounded by barbed wire, came into view on the horizon. The sight sent a jolt of icy fear through Anna. This was it. This was the place where the true horrors were to be unleashed. The stories had spoken of crowded, disease-ridden spaces, of brutality and humiliation. As the truck rumbled to a stop, the 2 guards motioned for them to disembark. The air was cold and damp, and the ground was a sea of mud. They were led through a gate, past a watchtower where a guard stood with a serious expression, and into a small clearing. The camp was a bustling hive of activity. American GIs, their uniforms a sea of olive drab, moved purposefully between the tents. There were other prisoners, both male and female, but they were kept in separate enclosures. The women were led to a large tent, a canvas structure that smelled of canvas, disinfectant, and a faint foreign scent of tobacco. Inside, a woman in an American WAC uniform stood waiting for them. She was a sergeant major, a woman named Eleanor Vance. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her expression was professional, almost cold. She motioned for them to form a line. "You will be processed," she said in a clear, authoritative voice, her German accented but perfectly understandable. Your personal belongings will be catalogued, and you will be issued new uniforms and bedding. You will be searched. Do not resist. The word searched sent a new wave of fear through the group. The propaganda had been explicit about what that meant. Anna watched as the first woman, a frail young woman named Greta, was taken behind a canvas screen. The silence from behind the screen was agonizing. Then Greta emerged, her face pale, but otherwise unharmed. She clutched a pair of worn boots and a drab uniform, but she was not crying, not bruised. Anna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When it was her turn, Anna was led behind the screen by a female MP, a young woman with a kind face. She was thorough but respectful. She asked Anna to remove her uniform, then searched it for hidden items. She checked Anna's pockets and the lining of her coat. She found a small, worn photograph of Anna's parents. She looked at it for a moment, her expression softening, then handed it back. You can keep this, she said quietly. The simple act of human consideration was a shock. It was not what she had been led to believe. They were then led to a washroom. There were hot showers. For the first time in months, Anna felt the cleansing stream of hot water on her skin. It was a simple luxury, but it felt like a small miracle, a sign that they were not to be treated as subhuman. Afterward, they were given new uniforms, plain brown dresses that were clean and warm. They were then assigned to a large barrack tent with beds, blankets, and pillows. It was Spartan but clean and dry. The other women in the tent were a mix of nurses and civilian administrative staff. Some were withdrawn and afraid, others were wary but starting to let their guard down. The American guards, all female, were always present but never intrusive. They were polite and professional, addressing them as Frau and Fräulein rather than shouting insults. The first days were a blur of new routines. Roll call in the morning, followed by a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. Then, a few hours of supervised work, mostly cleaning and organizing the camp. The meals, though simple, were plentiful and nourishing. They were given canned food, bread, and even small amounts of sugar and coffee. To a people who had been surviving on rations and ersatz ingredients for years, it was a feast. Anna, ever the leader, began to talk to the other women, trying to understand their experiences. They had all been told the same things, fed the same lies. The unexpected politeness, the simple kindnesses, were a profound source of confusion and relief. The Americans, they were realizing, were not the monsters they had been made out to be. There were no beatings, no public humiliations, no cruelty. There was only a quiet, professional efficiency and a strange, almost disarming respect. One afternoon, a young American woman, a corporal, approached Anna while she was sweeping the barrack tent. "You were a nurse?" she asked in hesitant German. Anna nodded. "Yes, for the Red Cross." The corporal's face softened. "My mother is a nurse," she said, a small, sad smile on her face. "She's at home in Ohio. She used to write to me about all her patients. I can't imagine what you've seen." The conversation was brief, a simple exchange, but it felt monumental. It was the first time an American had seen her not just as an enemy, but as a person, a woman, a professional with a shared experience. This quiet, slow-dawning realization was the most powerful thing of all. The Americans were not conquering beasts, but individuals, with mothers and families and lives of their own. Their humanity was not a weakness, but a strength. The camp became a strange sort of sanctuary, a place where the fear of the war was replaced by the simple need to survive and a bewildering sense of safety. They were still prisoners, of course, their freedom taken. But the chains that bound them were not made of cruelty, but of the simple, unyielding logic of war. And it was this simple, profound politeness, this stark contrast to everything they had been told, that left a greater, more lasting impression than any abuse ever could. For Anna, the true test was not in surviving the fear of the enemy, but in reconciling the profound contradiction of a war that promised annihilation, but delivered in its wake an unexpected form of quiet grace. But the war wasn't over yet, and they would soon discover that their unexpected sanctuary was not as isolated from the world as they had hoped. Their new reality would be tested in a way none of them could have anticipated. The routine of the camp, once a source of comfort, began to feel like a monotonous, unending cycle. The days blended into weeks, marked only by the change in the weather and the occasional hushed conversation among the women. The sense of safety, so novel at first, had settled into a quiet, almost boring existence. The war, a distant rumble on the horizon, felt like a memory. But then a new group of prisoners arrived. They were not nurses or civilians. They were women of the Luftwaffe, young, hardened, and still fiercely loyal to the Nazi cause. They were defiant, their eyes filled with a smoldering resentment and contempt for their captors and for the other prisoners who, in their eyes, had become too compliant. Their arrival shattered the fragile peace of the camp. They refused to speak English, even when they knew it. They sang German patriotic songs, their voices a defiant, jarring counterpoint to the quiet hum of the camp. They sneered at the American guards, calling them Schwein and Untermenschen, and they looked at Anna and her group with open scorn. The most vocal of the newcomers was a tall, severe-looking woman named Helga, a former radio operator. Her eyes were hard and unyielding. She saw the other women's cooperation as a betrayal, a sign of weakness. She believed the American politeness was a cunning ruse, a way to lull them into a false sense of security before the true humiliation began. "Don't you see?" she would whisper to the others, her voice a low, furious hiss. "This is a form of torture. They are trying to break our spirit. They want us to forget who we are." Her words were a poison, slowly but surely infecting the quiet trust that had been built. A few of the younger women, still clinging to their pre-war beliefs, began to listen to her. They started to refuse work details, to speak insolently to the guards. The atmosphere in the camp grew tense. The American guards, who had been so patient, now had to be more firm. They maintained their professionalism, but their expressions were now weary and strained. The quiet respect was being replaced by a more formal, distant protocol. One afternoon, a young WAC named Corporal Jenkins, who had a friendly relationship with Anna, pulled her aside. "What's going on with the new ones?" she asked, her voice low. "They're causing trouble. If they keep this up, the commanding officer will have to take action." Anna explained the mindset of the new group, the deep-seated belief in the propaganda they had been fed. Jenkins listened, her face grim. "We're not trying to hurt them," she said, her voice filled with a genuine frustration. "We're just trying to get through this thing. They're making it harder for everyone." Anna knew that the corporal was right. The new group's defiance was not just hurting them, but jeopardizing the safety and relative comfort of everyone. The fragile peace was at risk. Anna decided she had to act. She knew that reasoning with Helga was pointless, but she could talk to the others. She gathered the women who had been there from the beginning and reminded them of the first night, of the simple acts of kindness they had been shown. She spoke of the hot showers, the clean clothes, and the simple dignity they had been afforded. "They could have treated us like animals," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But they didn't. They treated us like human beings. Don't let their fear and anger destroy that. We have a responsibility to ourselves to maintain our own dignity, no matter what they say." Her words had an effect. The original group of prisoners, united by their shared experience, held firm. They continued their routines, they were respectful to the guards, and they subtly but firmly distanced themselves from the newcomers. The division in the camp was now clear, those who had been broken by the war and those who were still fighting it, even in captivity. But the real test came a week later. A convoy of American military vehicles arrived at the camp, not with new prisoners, but with a surprising cargo. They were German civilians, men and women, old and young, who had been displaced by the war. They were starving, exhausted, and desperately ill. The American commander of the camp, a major, gathered the German prisoners together. "These people need help," he said through a translator. "We have limited medical staff and supplies. We know many of you are nurses and medical personnel. We are asking for your help. This is a volunteer basis. You will be working with our American doctors and nurses, and you will be treated as equals. This is not an order. This is a request." A ripple of murmuring went through the crowd. Helga scoffed, muttering something about a trap. But Anna didn't hesitate. She stepped forward. "I will help," she said. A few of the other original nurses followed her lead. Even some of the new, more compliant prisoners, seeing the desperate state of their countrymen, stepped forward as well. Helga and her followers, however, remained in their defiant circle, their expressions unyielding. For the next 2 weeks, the camp was transformed. The American and German nurses worked side by side, a strange, beautiful symphony of cooperation. They cared for the sick, tended to the wounds, and shared their knowledge and experience. The language barrier was an obstacle, but they overcame it with gestures and a shared professional understanding. Anna found herself working closely with an American Army doctor, a compassionate and skilled man named Dr. Harris. They treated children with fevers, the elderly with malnutrition, and the wounded with a quiet, efficient grace. The sight of the American soldiers and doctors treating their own people with such care and concern was a powerful antidote to the poison of the new prisoners' hatred. It was a testament to the idea that humanity, even in the midst of war, could not be extinguished. But the true significance of their work would soon be made clear, in a way that would force even the most hardened of hearts to confront a truth they had desperately tried to ignore. The war had created a new kind of suffering, a suffering that extended far beyond the battlefield, and their compassionate care was the only thing standing between these innocent people and oblivion. The next day, a high-ranking American officer would arrive at the camp, and his purpose would change everything, forcing them all to confront the true nature of their captivity and the uncomfortable truth about the world they had once so fiercely believed in. The arrival of the new American officer was a tense and somber affair. He was a colonel, an older man with a grim, world-weary expression. He was accompanied by a small group of aides and a photographer. The entire camp was on edge. He gathered all the prisoners, both the new and the old, in the main clearing. The American major who commanded the camp stood at his side. The colonel's German was fluent and precise, and his voice was low and powerful, resonating with an unshakable authority. "I am Colonel Anderson," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "And I have come here to show you something. Something you need to see. Something the world needs to see. Something your leaders have gone to great lengths to hide from you." He then proceeded to show them a series of photographs. They were black and white, stark and horrifying. They were photographs of the concentration camps that the Allied forces had just liberated. The images were incomprehensible to the German prisoners. Skeletal figures piled like cordwood, starving, emaciated people with hollow eyes. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the mountains of shoes and personal belongings. A low murmur of disbelief and shock rippled through the crowd. "This is a lie," Helga hissed, her face pale. "This is propaganda. American lies." The colonel's eyes fixed on her, and his voice took on an even more chilling tone. "I wish it were, Fräulein. But it is not. These are photographs from Dachau, from Buchenwald, from Auschwitz. My men liberated these places. They were there. They saw it with their own eyes. They have found the survivors, and they have found the dead. This is what your leaders did. This is what your great Reich built." The silence that followed was deafening. The photographer then pulled a large, professionally printed photograph from his satchel and held it up for all to see. It was a picture of a German soldier, a young man, weeping uncontrollably as he was forced to walk past a pile of starved corpses. "This soldier," the colonel said, his voice now a quiet, sorrowful thunder. "He was also a prisoner. He was captured, but we did not humiliate him. We did not torture him. We gave him food and water and medical care. And then we showed him this. He saw the truth and he was broken by it. The colonel's words were a carefully aimed missile designed to shatter their illusions. He was not there to gloat. He was not there to humiliate them. He was there to bear witness to the truth and to force them to look at it." Anna felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The propaganda had been a veil, a shield. But the colonel's words and the horrifying images were a stark and brutal reality check. It was a truth so monstrous, so unthinkable that the only possible response was to deny it. But the evidence was right there, in front of them, in the colonel's hands. He continued to speak, his voice filled with a quiet, sorrowful anger. He spoke of the humanity of the American soldiers who liberated the camps. He spoke of their horror, their disbelief. He spoke of their resolve to bring the perpetrators to justice. He then turned his attention to the original group of prisoners, the nurses. I have heard of your work with the civilians, he said, his voice softening. I have seen the reports. You have shown a great compassion, a great professionalism. You have shown a part of your country that the world needs to see. Not the cruelty of the SS, not the hatred of the Gestapo, but the quiet, simple humanity that still exists here. His words were a balm, a lifeline in a sea of despair. They were an acknowledgement of their dignity, a small island of validation in a vast ocean of shame and grief. But they were also a challenge. He was asking them to choose between the lies they had been told and the truth that was now staring them in the face. Helga, however, remained defiant. "It is a lie!" she screamed. "A lie from the enemy, to turn us against our own people." The colonel looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "Fräulein," he said, his voice hard, "you can believe what you want. But the truth is not for me to give to you. It is for you to discover. It is for you to reconcile with your conscience." The meeting was dismissed, and the prisoners dispersed in a state of shock and confusion. The camp was now a place of turmoil. The original prisoners, the nurses, were grappling with the enormity of what they had seen. It was a profound betrayal, a deep wound to their national pride. The new prisoners, led by Helga, were more defiant than ever, convinced that this was just another layer of the American deception. They were a microcosm of a country in turmoil, a nation divided between the truth and the lie, between the past and the future. Anna found herself sitting with Dr. Harris, the American Army doctor she had been working with. She was shaken, her hands trembling. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How could they? How could our own people do such a thing?" Dr. Harris, a kind man with tired eyes, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I don't have the answers, Anna," he said. "The world is a complicated place, but what you saw today is a part of it, a part we all have to face." The colonel's visit had not been an act of cruelty. It was a form of brutal, necessary compassion. He was forcing them to see the truth so that they might in some small way begin to heal. But the revelation had a more profound consequence than any of them could have anticipated. It would not only force them to confront their past, but it would also force them to choose a side, not just in the war, but in the battle for their own souls. The next day, the colonel would issue a new directive, one that would put them all to a test they never expected, and one that would force them to confront their own humanity in the face of unimaginable horror. The morning after Colonel Anderson's visit was marked by a chilling silence. The usual sounds of the camp, the low hum of activity, the clatter of mess kits were absent. The prisoners walked around in a daze, their faces etched with a profound sense of shock and betrayal. Helga and her followers, though still defiant, were now more subdued, their usual bluster replaced by a quiet, simmering fury. They were still clinging to the belief that the photographs were a hoax, but the sheer weight of the evidence, the visceral reality of the colonel's words, had clearly shaken their resolve. Anna, however, found herself in a different kind of anguish. The images she had seen were seared into her mind. The humanity she had so recently found in the American soldiers was now being forced to reconcile with the monstrous inhumanity of her own countrymen. The cognitive dissonance was a crushing weight. She sought out Dr. Harris, the American doctor. She found him sitting alone, hunched over a cup of coffee. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a familiar weariness. "It's a lot to take in," he said before she could even speak. "I know." Anna sat down beside him, her hands clasped in her lap. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do you treat the sick, care for the innocent, and then see something like that and not lose all hope?" Dr. Harris was silent for a long moment, staring into his cup. "I don't know," he said finally. "All I know is that the answer to that kind of hate and cruelty isn't more hate. It's not a bigger bomb or a crueler act. It's a simple, everyday act of kindness. It's a bowl of hot soup. It's a clean bandage. It's a word of comfort. It's in the small things, Anna. That's where we find our hope. That's where we find our humanity." Later that afternoon, the camp commander, the American major, gathered the prisoners once again. He held a small, weathered notebook in his hand. "Colonel Anderson has issued a new directive," he announced, his voice firm but not unkind. "As of tomorrow, a new work detail will be established. It is a volunteer position. The work will be difficult. It will be unpleasant. but it is necessary." He then proceeded to explain. A nearby town, recently liberated by American forces, was in ruins. The sanitation systems were destroyed, and the town was littered with debris, the unburied dead, and unexploded ordnance. A typhus epidemic was starting to take hold. The American forces had their hands full with military operations, and they needed help. They needed help to clean the town, to bury the dead, and to try to stop the spread of the disease. "This will be a dangerous job," the major said, "and it is entirely voluntary. If you choose to do it, you will be given better food, a small stipend, and access to more medical supplies. You will also be working side by side with our own soldiers, many of whom have volunteered for this task." The silence that followed was different from the one after the colonel's visit. This one was not born of shock, but of quiet contemplation. The women looked at each other, their faces a mix of fear and resolve. Helga, however, was immediately defiant. "This is a trap!" she yelled. "They are sending us to our deaths." A few of her followers nodded in agreement, but their conviction was now less certain. Anna, her mind clear, stepped forward. "I will do it," she said, her voice firm. "And I will need nurses with me." The nurses who had worked with her to help the civilians immediately stepped forward. One by one, more and more women, both from her original group and even a few of the newer prisoners, volunteered. The group that stepped forward was a testament to the power of a shared experience, a shared sense of humanity. They were not doing this for the Americans. They were doing it for themselves and for the sake of the civilians, their countrymen who were suffering. Helga, however, remained with her small, shrinking group of loyalists, her expression a mixture of contempt and disbelief. "You are fools," she said, her voice filled with a desperate fury. "You are helping the enemy. You are betraying your country." Anna looked at her, her eyes filled with a quiet pity. "No, Helga," she said. "We are not betraying our country. We are trying to save it. We are doing the work that our leaders should have done. We are cleaning up their mess." The next morning, the group of volunteers was loaded into the back of a truck, and they were taken to the ruined town. The devastation was worse than Anna could have imagined. Buildings were reduced to rubble. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. The streets were littered with the belongings of a life that was now gone. But the American soldiers, both male and female, were already there. They were digging, cleaning, and helping the few remaining survivors. They were working tirelessly, their faces grim but their resolve unshaken. For the next several weeks, Anna and the other German women worked alongside the American soldiers. They were a strange, efficient team. They spoke different languages, but they communicated with gestures and a shared, profound purpose. They buried the dead, tended to the sick, and helped clear the debris. The work was grueling, and the danger was real. They were working in a war-torn landscape, and the threat of unexploded ordnance was ever present. But the shared struggle, the shared purpose, forged a new kind of bond between them. Anna found herself working with a young American soldier, a private named Johnson, who had lost a brother in the war. He was quiet, and his movements were deliberate and efficient. They worked side by side, and one afternoon, he handed her a small photograph. It was of his brother, a young man with a bright smile. "He was a medic," Johnson said in broken German. "He was just trying to help. He was a good man." Anna looked at the photograph, and she saw not a faceless enemy, but a grieving brother, a sorrowful human being. It was in that moment that she understood the profound and terrible cost of the war, not just on her own people, but on all of them. But as they worked, a new kind of hope, a new kind of friendship began to grow. The true test of their humanity was not in the abstract. It was in the dirt, and the debris, and the sorrowful eyes of the survivors. It was in the simple, quiet act of doing what was right, even when it was difficult and dangerous. The work they were doing was a form of redemption, a way of atoning for the sins of a nation, one small, compassionate act at a time. The Americans, in their quiet professionalism and unexpected kindness, were not just liberators, but healers. But their newfound camaraderie and fragile peace would soon be challenged by the return of a face from Anna's past, a man she had once respected, but who now represented the darkest and most dangerous part of the war. The work in the ruined town continued for weeks, a slow, painstaking process of healing a wounded landscape. The bond between the German prisoners and the American soldiers deepened with every shovel of dirt, every blanket offered to a shivering survivor. Anna and Private Johnson had developed a quiet, unspoken friendship. They would sit together during their breaks, sharing a thermos of coffee and a tin of food, their conversations a halting mix of German and English, punctuated by long, comfortable silences. Anna had learned about his home in Iowa, his love for farming, and the quiet grief he carried for his brother. He, in turn, had learned about her life before the war, her dreams of becoming a doctor, and the sorrow she felt for the broken world they were trying to mend. The Americans were not conquering heroes. They were just men and women doing a terrible job in a terrible place. Their humanity was not a sign of weakness, but a wellspring of quiet, unshakable strength. Then one afternoon, as they were clearing rubble from a collapsed building, a large American jeep rumbled into the town square. A group of American officers disembarked, but Anna's attention was drawn to the man with them. He was a German officer, his uniform crisp and clean, his bearing still haughty and proud. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew this man. He was Colonel Heinrich von Kessel, a high-ranking officer in the Wehrmacht, a man she had once treated at her field hospital. He had been a hero to her, a symbol of the disciplined professional army she had once believed in. But as she looked at him now, a cold dread crept into her heart. His eyes, though weary, still held the cold fire of fanaticism. He was not a prisoner. He was a liaison, a high-ranking official who was cooperating with the American forces to help with the surrender of the remaining German forces. Colonel von Kessel saw Anna, and his face remained impassive for a moment. Then a flicker of recognition, a glint of something that was not quite contempt but not quite relief, crossed his features. He said something to the American officers in English, then walked directly towards her. "Fräulein Schmidt," he said, his voice a smooth, low purr, "I see you have adjusted to your new circumstances." There was an undertone of mockery in his words. Anna stood her ground, her back ramrod straight. "Colonel," she replied, her voice steady, "we are doing what is necessary. We are helping our people." He let out a short, hollow laugh. "Helping them?" He scoffed. "You are cooperating with the enemy. You are a traitor to your country, Fräulein, working alongside them, fraternizing with them. Have you forgotten everything you were told?" Anna felt a surge of anger, a profound, righteous fury that had been building for months. "I have forgotten nothing, Colonel," she said, her voice rising. "I remember the propaganda. I remember the lies. I remember the stories you told us about how the enemy would treat us. And I am here to tell you that they were all lies. The Americans did not humiliate us. They did not abuse us. They gave us hot coffee and clean clothes and a place to sleep. And then they showed us the truth about what our own people did, the truth about the camps, about the mass graves. They showed us the face of real evil, Colonel, and it was not theirs. It was ours." Colonel von Kessel's face hardened, his lips a thin white line. "You are a fool," he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You have been brainwashed. They have broken you." Anna shook her head, her gaze unflinching. "No, Colonel," she said. "They did not break us. They gave us a chance to save ourselves, a chance to find our humanity again, the humanity you so willingly threw away. They showed us that the measure of a man is not in his uniform or his rank, but in the kindness he shows to a stranger, even an enemy." The American officers had been watching the exchange, their expressions grim. One of them, the colonel who had shown them the photographs, stepped forward. "Colonel," he said to von Kessel, his voice firm, "we are here to do a job. These women are helping. We expect you to do the same." Von Kessel, his eyes filled with a furious contempt, said nothing. He simply nodded curtly and turned away, his back a rigid, unyielding symbol of a world that was dying. But as he walked away, Anna felt a profound sense of relief. She had chosen her side. She had confronted the lies she had been told and the man who had embodied them. The war for her was no longer a battle of nations, but a battle for the soul, and she had made her choice. But the confrontation had a far deeper purpose. Colonel von Kessel was on his way to an internment camp for high-ranking German officers, a place where the American authorities had begun to implement a new and even more radical program of denazification. He was a product of the Nazi regime, a man of profound belief and unshakable loyalty. He was a man who, unlike Anna, had no space in his soul for the truth. And it was a man like him, she knew, who would be the ultimate test of the Americans' unconventional approach to their prisoners. The true battle for the hearts and minds of a generation was not yet over, and it would be fought, not with weapons, but with truth and quiet, unyielding compassion. The true story of the American POW camps, she now understood, was not one of conquering and domination, but of a quiet, persistent battle for the very soul of a defeated nation. The final act of this strange, quiet drama was about to unfold, and it would not be a victory of arms, but of an idea, a test of whether humanity could survive even the most monstrous of ideologies.